Okay, now I'm gonna try to do this week's video pretty quickly. If you remember me discussing, I said I was going to do one on controlled opposition. This should be the last one in like the Marxist type videos, and I'm gonna move on to something else. I did discuss a little bit of this last video, which kind of took a deviation and went to the C. Dolores Tucker stuff and back to the rap, gangster rap era, hip hop stuff. But now I'm going to try to get back on track again, like I mentioned, get back on the videos on Marxism and philosophy and stuff like that. So today it's going to be around controlled opposition. So what I want to try to do first is discuss a little bit of fascism, given that's one of the primary, elements within bourgeois, capitalist, liberal democratic societies. Fascism is one of the primary controlled opposition movements that's utilized. The elements are utilized over and over and over again throughout history. And then I might want to discuss like the Democratic Republican parties and stuff like that, but I might not. I might just do that kind of within, because I did discuss a little bit of this in a C. Dolores Tucker video about how the history of how each party works, but I don't know if I want to get into that completely here. I might just maybe touch on it a little bit. It just depends how long it takes me just to go through this type of stuff. So I guess I could start by saying that one thing that just has to be understood, just relatively obvious, is that any group of people in power or ruling class, doesn't really matter. They're always going to understand, or just any person in general is always going to understand, and within a society, within a social framework, within a social relation, there's always going to be opposition. So if that's the default, that's a given. This is going to happen. The only logical conclusion to reach from there is that if you want to maintain your power, obviously besides just total physical, dominance and force, which obviously is going to be able to go to a certain point. And at that certain point, you're going to have to realize that you're going to have to control the opposition. So if people are just going to oppose the system, or you, a ruling class, whatever, you're going to have to control it such that the individuals who do fall into the opposition categories fall into categories specifically where you could filter them into these categories, which are oppositional, but don't necessarily oppose the system as such that it threatens your power. And obviously, historically, and within capitalism, so far, the ruling class has been very good at that. They've been very good at from different elements. And the way this connects to Marxism is not only have they been good at with it from what we call fascism, or what we just call just general liberalism, just through filtering people into the mainstream ideology, but they've been really good even with bourgeois socialism, of filtering people into democratic socialists and social democratic frameworks that are democratic frameworks that don't threaten the power of the ruling class. So that's what I want to discuss a little bit here right now. And so we're going to start out with fascism. And I tried to find a definition, working definition, that I try to just look at, Wikipedia, just to try to get a basic definition. Most of the definitions that you would go to on Wikipedia or something like that, they could get kind of detailed. I saw some of them here we got by some scholars where it says, basically a 14 point, 10 point, definitions of what fascism is. So I don't want to go through all of these just for the sake of time. And so I'm going to go, I did at one point click on the etymology, and just so we know kind of, where the term, derived from, I think is always important. Even if that doesn't necessarily end up being what drove the new definition historically. It usually always connects back to that, though. So it talks about the Italian term for bundle of sticks, and it talks about obviously Mussolini. So this is around the time frame that fascism as a European trajectory started. And if I look at something like this definition, it says fascism is a complex mutable political ideology, which came into prominence in the 20s and the 30s in Europe. Most notorious example of fascist governments have been Mussolini, obviously, and then obviously they're going to mention Hitler. So basically, I would define fascism from the start as a 20th century movement, European movement of the 20th century, just around these groups that arose during the time. But obviously, that's not the way the term gets applied generally, because I would just describe it as like a specific movement. Like if you're talking about like a specific era, a specific movement that's surrounded around a particular era of time, that's how I would look at fascism. Just because that's how it gets labeled. But if you look at the elements of what these particular movements that get labeled fascism or that label themselves, I guess in a sense fascist, we look at these elements here, and if I could simplify the definition, here's how I would take a lot of these definitions and filter them into something that's more simplistic. And I think I've seen this done before, but I couldn't remember actually specifically which scholarship or whatever use these like kind of four, but most of them kind of revolve around these four but just expand into like other elements. So I would say elements of nationalism, racism or racial essentialism, obviously with usually some form of if not it's outright supremacy, usually some form of just favoritism to the particular national identity, racial identity. And obviously anti-communism is huge. Now sometimes people throw in anti-liberalism into this. I might discuss that in a second, but anti-communism is the primary element. And then totalitarianism. And totalitarianism in this sense, I would define basically as a form of like a authoritarian government that kind of doesn't give any deviation as far as any room for the individual within the framework. So there's no deviation between and enforced by violence of the state. I guess I should add. So it's not like like in a moral sense, right, where you have like a moral state structure where people are just culturally aligned with each other and kind of in sync as far as their attitudes just naturally in a moral sense. But one of where there's a kind of like an overarching state ideology that this enforced throughout, like leaving no room for individual expression or opposition to that, right? So and then in its totality, so through every aspect of life, from education to the military, police, the court systems, just throughout, right? But the issue that you're going to see with definitions of fascism or with these four pillars specifically, which I would consider the main pillars of the movement, is that if you take these and apply them to just liberal capitalist democracy, what you're going to notice is that these frameworks already exist within liberal capitalist democracy. So if you take a state like the United States, for example, and you look at the history of the United States, at what point would the elements of totalitarianism, anti-communism, racism, and nationalism not be necessary aspects, right? And this could be almost applied to any situation, right? So I mean, in a sense, even if you wanted to try to argue that you could make like deviations between nationalism to like a hyper nationalism, I mean, do you draw the line? As far as how that's expressed by the state or supported by individuals. I mean, I really don't know. But these elements, just in general, I mean, it almost cannot be argued they don't exist. Fundamental to liberalism. I mean, it has to include at least some form of nationalism to maintain over time within a particular state. You're going to have to make the capitalistic elements, as happened in the United States, fundamental, right? Um, and you're going to have to engage in totalitarian control. It's going to have to be one way or the other, right? So people try to make a distinction between maybe what you consider an inverted totalitarianism, or I heard that term thrown out there, versus the type and other. But I mean that would even be kind of ignoring the state power utilized by the U.S. and by corporate powers within the U.S. against the poor, against working class, against black people and other non-white groups, right? So I mean, if you look at the elements, those elements, like I said, exist throughout. So this is why I don't like to make a distinction between um, liberal capitalist democracy and then fascism. Using the term fascism to describe like a deviation from liberal capitalist democracy, as liberals would do, is very beneficial to capitalism and bourgeoisie, and specifically. And I think this is an error that a lot of Marxists make by trying to do this. Right now, they will try then to redirect, but I mean, who has the power of redirection here? I mean, are the bourgeoisie going to have more power to redirect, fascism against something that they're opposed to, or are you going to have a power to redirect it to them? And then what does that do? And then to the sense of understanding, what the actual core issue is. If like I mentioned in the previous videos of making the critique of political economy, right, the core element. Well, if you're making the critique of political economy the core element, what you have to understand is that by trying to say like this, some fascism exists, some deviation exists, what you're going to end up doing is taking it away from the fact that no, these are the core pillars of what already exists as the political economic structure and the social relation exists that is capital. And what I want to get into really quickly is just to discuss how basically different groups of people, like if we're talking about like Marxists and like liberals, could come to understand like what these elements kind of mean, like how they would interpret based on, and how you get certain individuals like be able to understand particular frameworks, such as that, like for example within totalitarianism, how could you have people saying the communism and basically Nazism or fascism in that sense through the 20th century movements were similar or the same, and how what are the elements, right? So to start, I guess I could go to what did liberalism represent, and this is what I'm getting back to when I mentioned earlier that I said I'll get back to this, is that liberalism within the when from an anti-communist perspective, how like this fascist movement could also be viewed as anti-liberal, and then obviously the Marxist kind of framework goes into this as well. So basically, going back, what liberalism through like the Enlightenment period kind of contributed to in practice, but without like without any type of thought going into how society was going to be shaped, without the power relations really being kind of under someone else's control. The only logical conclusion to liberalism was through an individualism which freed up the bourgeoisie to enter state and ideological power by usurping or like chipping away at the power that existed by the previous I guess framework of religious theocratic monarchy, etc. Like, so what you would consider basically, republicanism. So no longer ruled by, just simply, the dictate of some monarch, but by the rule of, like legal systems expressed through like an individuality that allowed for religious expression. So all basically the common element cores of liberalism. Well, this allowed, for the power of the state at that time. And this is why the power of the state, becomes important within those frameworks as you go throughout history. And that's how you can get like a libertarianism developed, as, opposed to, the state, but from a capitalistic, framework, right? Is because understanding of the state through uh, basically an ability in moral frameworks as an ability to hold back, capital from, usurping the power from, aristocratic ruling class, and basically exerting their own dominance over the social relation and ruling class politics. And obviously that kind of explains that. So if that's what you get, through liberalism, what Marxists came to understand is through the Hegelian sense of, if you get that negation of the basically the negation of, the state, the unity that was once, held by, religious dominance, through like the medieval period or whatever you want to call it, Christendom or whatever you want to call it. If you get a chipping away, a negation of this through the individual, right? That could be viewed as a freedom, right? And capitalism could even be viewed as a freedom within that, in and of itself. And that's how you get people, today ideologically, who can accept, capitalism as this sort of free enterprise, this free, this like an inherent freedom of voluntary association or whatever they want to call it. But what Marx realized is that, and you can look at someone like Chomsky, I guess young Marx and Chomsky. There's a video probably on Chomsky where he discusses like, libertarian socialism and connection to, classic old liberalism or whatever, however he puts the terms. Like, basically his argument, I think, was that extent, like basically similar to Marx, I would say, is that the true line between like liberalism could be drawn between libertarian socialism today and not liberalism, or that how, like, basically libertarianism from a right wing perspective maybe doesn't make as much sense. But then obviously I would disagree with that. But the same thing with Marx. His was a little bit obviously a better analysis because it was focused on the political economy of it. But from a political economic perspective, you have this individualism that in fact does just benefit the bourgeoisie through their ability to then take ruling class power, and you have this new social relation that forms, but through the negation does not come back to supersede that negation, to come back into a whole that takes the socialized framework of socializing production for the production of commodities, basically socializes that production, but then doesn't take the wealth created by that production and doesn't take the overall social achievements into a socialized sense, right? So you're socializing the production, but you're individualizing the profits and the power of the state in the political economic system to a specific group of individuals, ruling class, called the bourgeoisie, or labeled as bourgeoisie, or middle class at that time, and middle class still today. As that was the topic of the previous video that I just did. I think not last week, but the week before that. So understanding that, you should be able to then understand how different individuals could fall into different categories of thought. So the liberals fundamentally miss the political economic critique, basically. So what a liberal can then see in that sense is a Stalin and a Hitler, being, similar, because they're viewing both the totality in the sense of taking the political economic structures back into control of the people, as just as threatening as even an opposition to that, taking the kind of the social aspects back into the state, right? And that is where ideologically the fascist controlled opposition tendency was utilized and slipped in, right? And that's why the focus, particularly on that, goes back to a nationalism. And like I said, these elements already existed, but herein is where the like the hyper kind of expansion of that becomes the goal and concern, because what you have basically is a situation where once you start having people oppose capitalism, which they're ultimately going to do, like I mentioned, and you have socialist movements, what you could basically define fascism as is a socialist movement. That's what they were. There were socialist movements that happened in Europe, but the socialist movements formed such as then to also oppose, communism. And if you look at it, especially in the sense of in Germany specifically, there was basically no way that someone like Hitler could organically have taken power without the intervention of other states into that obviously, from World War One onward, or even probably before that, but especially from the intra-war period, where you had tons of capital investments within the German framework. You had tons of outside influence potentially on some of the leadership, the democratic leadership of Germany that took power around that time, who then engaged in anti-communist elements themselves. And then you had like assassination, like people like Rosa Luxemburg and stuff like that. And then you have obviously support thrown behind Hitler, and then you have support, obviously him being able to rise to power in a way that is seemingly not very democratic. If you look at a lot of the actions and elements, the stuff that they were able to get away with, that obviously, almost any other sense have been opposed and easily, defeated by, forces that weren't specifically trying to say that the bigger threat was a communist threat to them, right? So that's how basically these things could be viewed, right? So for Hitler, or for any of these other type of people that get labeled as fascism, the bourgeoisie could throw their support behind them to oppose communism, and then they just ride with the other elements, because ultimately, as long as capital has power, the ultimate power, even if a quote unquote fascist leader decided to, you know, overthrow, Europe or something like that, it's only going to work to the capitalist benefit, right? So what you had, in a sense of Hitler, even without going into any type of conspiratorial elements of Hitler being an agent of the British and U.S. governments to begin with, or any type of that stuff, um, just looking at it from the overall, just basic historical framework, he moves obviously towards, Britain through France and stuff like that. But I mean, almost like crucially, just turns around and goes straight after the Soviet Union. The majority of deaths, the majority of, you know, I guess destruction, to the people happened, and the majority of sacrifice happened, from the Soviet communist states, and what eventually became communist state, the USSR. So that was utilized obviously one way. Another way, Germany being destroyed is obviously very important because if Germany would have became a communist state, that would have had obviously a huge impact on the West, obviously, if or if any of the other states. But obviously, Germany would be probably the largest, most significant one, particularly because of their opposition or their potential ability to create an opposition with Britain. You know what I mean? Specifically within the European framework. So Germany had to be controlled in that sense. And then obviously had the anti-communism, which worked to your favor. And then obviously once, the Soviets started winning the war, then you could come in late, as happened, take basically, claim ownership historically of that, the win, as you being against, this fascist deviation. And then you basically go straight into Cold War mode, and your true colors come out of what the the obvious objective was from the beginning, which was to just oppose communism. And then come the ideas about how communism and fascism were basically essentially the same anyway, because they were both attacking the individual liberal freedoms that existed, although they were doing it kind of a completely different and obvious sense. But if you only view things through the framework of liberalism and not, critique of political economy, then you're not going to see, obviously, the issue with that framework at all. So I think that was clear enough. If it wasn't, I guess someone could let me know. I could explain it again, maybe some other time. But to move forward, another thing to be able to discuss is the moral frameworks that exist within these, I guess I should say. And if you look at it, the primary moral frameworks that exist within liberalism, that uphold liberalism, revolve sort of around, or I guess I could go back to conservatism, right? So if you have a conservative that exists within, liberal society, the fundamental difference between them and a liberal, because like if you take America, for example, like the entire framework is liberal. No conservative in the United States becomes thus reactionary by supporting some type of monarchy or like traditional like society. The traditional society within the United States was already capitalist, it was already liberal. So the only thing that you could even potentially conserve would be that liberalism. And this is a point to bring up here, why like the conservatives might not make a distinction between this is another very important point as far as controlled opposition. So as far as why liberals might not make a distinction between even the Democratic Party and then the Marxists, is because if your whole point is conserve that liberal framework, any changes that happen within a society or even the moral framework, any accepted changes, it doesn't matter if it's radical or just reformist or just even small social elements that can create some sort of deviation in that framework, is going to be viewed obviously negatively, controlled within that ideological framework, right? So that's why you can get the understanding easily ingrained within the minds of people. See, the ruling class can understand things like this, and that way they can understand how to implement controlled opposition, right? So this is why identity politics and stuff like that became a big deal. And okay, so if I go back to explain this point, I got to make the one that I was trying to make before, which is the about the controlled opposition with regard to the moral frameworks, right? So if you have a deontological moral framework that's rooted in religion, because obviously if you look at the religious frameworks, it's going to be a little bit different than maybe the Kantian categorical imperative framework, right? One's more philosophical, one's more just surface level religious kind of dictates. So, but either way, they kind of come out to kind of the same, just hard rule based. This is right, this is wrong, black and white framework, right? And if you have this and you introduce things that are clearly, that they would clearly mentally frame as obviously wrong, um, I don't, it doesn't matter what it is, transgenderism, homosexuality, um, let me look at like, something like, abortion. Abortion's probably the biggest and most obvious. Um, like against like traditional like family structures. Um, like sexual like liberation, stuff like that, like promiscuity, drug use, so legalization of drugs. Let me see what else. Those should be core enough to get the point. You get the point with those. So basically, certain elements that you could be viewed as fundamentally immoral, but that you could also make an argument for why should exist to a certain extent within society. Those wedge issues are core are kind of like aimed at the that particular ideological element of the way they view morality, and what liberalism allowed for, which was one of the primary reasons why for one, why capitalism was able to take off, but another reason why it was able to be so successful is because the if you take away that element, then the things that previously would have been considered immoral, such as like money grubbing, or, wealth hoarding, asset hoarding, interest with loans, like screwing people over in business, certain elements of fraud that's inherent, to business, certain elements of getting over your fellow people and gaining wealth off of the work and ideas of your fellow people. Certain things like certain of those type of moral elements that you exist obviously within Judaism and even Christianity. Um, the If you have those moral frameworks, it's hard for that type of thing to take off. But then, if those things type of take off, and what you get is moral frameworks that revolve around. We saw a motivism, but I would say more relativism. So things are culturally could be considered relevant morally within particular cultural frameworks or individual like ideas, and then, like I said, like that probably culminated in motivism, which existed obviously I think it was the early 20th century when I started. There's a motivist movement that sort of took off a little bit. And then obviously you can get the conservative elements that could exist within an egoism as well, right? So a naive egoism, so understanding of doing things within your self-interest, um, but within like a short-sighted framework of self-interest. And then obviously you have the utilitarian, which is probably the biggest, through either viewed as harm reduction or through happiness, which can be really conformist, I guess, categories, which like I think said before about happiness, where you could really fit those within a system without actually having to kind of analyze, like as such, those particular ideas. And you could always through being through consequentialism, like fundamentally as well, you could always just use the fact that that it didn't happen yet. Like a good example of this would be Chomsky or the people who argued harm reduction with regard to Biden before he got elected. Obviously, you wouldn't be able to determine that until Biden got elected, right? So they could use the argument, and this is like how you can see it in practice, a practical point. So they could use the argument of Biden being a moral choice over Trump, for example, or over just opposing both parties because this is like we have to get the lesser of two evils, right? So and there's others completely impractical. So you get this reformist controlled opposition that exists through arguing the harm reduction, but then obviously that wouldn't be able to be determined until you actually saw the tangible harm created by both and then compared, right? So if Biden's not elected, then you're only going off the consequences of the actions, which don't exist yet. So that kind of negates that kind of argument against those type of moral frameworks to begin with, because you're not actually viewing the morality in and of itself through an analysis of, is this a moral decision? Right now, you're trying to view it basically based on consequences that might exist in the future, right? So, that's a very, very important point to make as well with regard to basically how those type of moral frameworks come into play. And then obviously, like I said, those could be utilized to filter certain individuals within different categories. So to move on from that, I guess the next thing I could discuss would be the liberal democratic, not liberal democratic, but social democratic frameworks, and how that relates basically back to the fascist elements. And basically, through a controlled opposition standpoint, specifically a controlled opposition standpoint, and in terms of how it's utilized by the bourgeoisie, there's not really a huge distinction to be made between the social democrats or the democratic socialists or the bourgeois socialists, as I would call them, and the fascists, because they serve the same purpose, which is to take the people's opposition to capitalism and filter them into things that could ultimately just benefit capitalism at the end. So not truly revolutionary in a sense. So if you take someone even like a Bernie Sanders, who served no real threat to capitalism because of his disposition, because of his politics, and then you allow energy of socialist energy to be thrown behind that, then you basically get the same conclusions. And in a sense, reformist tendency that is inherent already to capitalism in general, right? Because of the old classic rule. And I mentioned this rule before, but this is a classic rule you always have to go by in politics, is that there's two ways to maintain the power. And this is the deviation you get between the decision to be made between a fascist or a social quote unquote Democrat. Because they're both already inherently capitalist anyway. So a decision to be made is a political one of, as the ruling class, do you support the welfare state to buy off the poor, to buy off the proletariat, to buy off opposition with promises, gifts, tangible benefits to their lives, larger creation of a middle class, etc. Or do you just use violent opposition, and just basically kill the enemy, and exclude the enemy violently? And, obviously the tendency towards, utilizing, what we call, or is called fascism for that purpose, is the people who favor the violent method, just the straight repression of opposition. And obviously the social democratic element is supported by those who think that buying people off is a better strategy, long term or short term, or however you want to view it, for that purpose. And that's why you'll see the difference between the Republican and Democratic parties and how they handle that, specifically because they disagree on that point. They don't even disagree on that point. Because in general, they both understand that utilizing of both of these is going to give them greater flexibility at all times, and it's going to have greater success through filtering a higher amount of the population because of the different ideological view points at the fundamental level that exist across a social spectrum. They could filter more people if they utilize both of these. That's the point of the Democratic and Republican parties existing as the duopoly in the first place, because they know that they can control society easier through doing that than if they just had one party. If you look at the way the Democratic and Republican parties exist, and I think this is just basic history, so I'm not going to go into any sources on this, but if you look at the way that the Democratic and Republican parties existed, historically, I think you could, see basically why the Republican Party was formed, and a lot of people will say as an abolitionist party, but if you look beyond that through, what they actually had actually developed and like where it was coming from, is that big business could team with abolitionists to form a party that's ultimately fundamentally big business, because an opposition to slavery is an opposition to a system that could stand in the way of the development of capitalism if it didn't conform to all this particular agendas of the financier class, of the productive capitalist industrial class, and the merchant class. If the land owning aristocracy in the South of the United States didn't conform to all the agendas of that particular class, that'd become an issue, right? Because they have their own capitalist, kind of ideas, and how they make their money isn't necessarily completely tied to specifically to the overall development of capital. So you had an opposition, and you create a party for that. But obviously, that party, the Democratic Party, already being basically capitalist, in the sense that even if a lot of the leaders, even early on, came from slave owning type of racist type backgrounds, and basically was a white supremacist party, throughout the 20th century. I mean, still, it's the white supremacist party. That's basically what it is. It was the white supremacist party which supported capitalism. And the Republican Party was basically a capitalist party which supported white supremacy. Just because the elements of abolition existed at all, as we know, that's not necessarily an expression of an opposition to white supremacy. It's just an expression of opposition to particular practices that might not even necessarily benefit white supremacy long term. So if you take if you look at basically any of the even like the more radical abolitionists of the time period, they didn't really, none of them were really Marxists. None of them really saw the political economic element becoming the prime issue within the society moving forward. They still, even if they opposed like certain elements of wage labor, still thought that free labor and association could basically, because they were liberals, could basically move on. And if you look at the more which, that was a very small minority, even it was radical Republicans, and even thought that black people should have being given anything. If you look at the majority, they was either kind of indifferent to black people, just kind of but you had a lot who opposed slavery because of black people would be in there at all. And they were looking, obviously, if you look at the colonization society, there were people who were actively looking to kind of find ways to basically get rid of as many black people as they could, however that was possible. And obviously slavery, bringing in, potentially, that's why they shut off the slave trade, early on. Bringing in more, potential, combatants, they could potentially oppose your system, or not even potentially, that did oppose the system, or were going to inherently be opposed to the system, is not necessarily a good idea if you want to maintain that over time. So you had to do something, obviously, in that sense, to kind of cut that off before it became too much of like a ticking time bomb, basically. So that's sort of the development of the parties from that sense. And then so everything you have moving forward is opposition between the parties, as I already mentioned, with the one supporting more reactionary tendencies versus one supporting the liberal tendencies that become obviously reformist. It's basically because of that. The Democratic Party was inherently democratic in the sense that they wanted to appeal. They were the primary main party. The Republican Party was always just a controlled opposition party. And understand this, you'll also understand why controlled opposition is allowed to exist within the Republican Party, but not allowed to exist within the Democratic Party. And you also understand why the destruction of the Democratic Party is more important, because it's the main party. So if you don't destroy the main party, you can't replace it with another main party. You you can't destroy the controlled opposition party. I mean, because that's all it is controlled opposition. There's nothing to destroy really, because they I mean, they're controlled opposition. It could come in any form. And as you saw, once, particular, like once George Bush became unpopular, basically, for example, then they moved to someone like a Trump. I mean, they could always move, to different, frameworks, and allow different things in versus not, to be able to adapt themselves over time. So, I guess I could, I guess I think I made the point, so I could probably end it here. To the Marxism, I would say the very important point to make about the Marxism, was specifically with regards to the controlled opposition, is how bourgeois socialism could function. So, you can take those liberal elements that exist within, liberalism generally, apply that to Marxism. So now you have, liberal, moral frameworks that exist within, Marxist framework. There's already an inherent weakness in it anyway. So you can get a lot of these things that's not only going to, cause, a deficit from a more moral standpoint to your position, but it's going to trigger and, basically like kind of like keep away and repel, certain, potential supporters who, have, a fundamentally different moral framework that's rooted more in, and that's how they can control opposition there, right? So basically, if you have, that's what I already mentioned with the conservatives, so that you can get them into those moral frameworks that support, a more, kind of lack of breakdown of a social structure through the framework of morality. And that's where, like I said, the identity politics and stuff like that could play in. So you can get that stuff in a Marxist and form a negative association around that. And then in addition to that, you can also get, the reformist elements in. So you could also get the Marxists with, basically by dangling kind of, the stake in front of their faces, as far as, let's put a person out here who might say that they support healthcare, might say that they support, I guess, I mean, free college, or, just socialized programs in general, or like something like FDR, even Social Security stuff, social benefits just in general, housing, food, basically providing food for, the poor, increases in wages, and like, support for labor unions, and all of these things can be utilized as, controlled opposition tendencies against Marxists specifically, because they're all very vulnerable to those things, and every single one of those things can then be filtered back to the ruling class. Doesn't matter what it is, and it's pretty easy. I mean, it's very, very easy to do. So if I had to give, a conclusion, to not leave it at sort of like the kind of, oh, well, this is the problem. If I had to provide, a solution, and I think this has been done before, but it's not going to happen. So I mean, I don't even know why I even have to mention it. Would it be obviously to root out, those particular elements, and, get your framework, in place around kind of, basically the correct, analysis. And so one example would be stop, using the term, fascism, and just, use a description of the way capitalism functions. And like I mentioned, capitalism is always going to function as, through those elements. So whether or not it sways to, whether or not it sways to, kind of, a violent, kind of support for the fundamental tendencies of nationalism, racism, anti-communism, totalitarianism, if it goes to a more violent, framework of that, that's not necessary. That's like, you call it fascism if you want to call it fascism, but fundamentally, what it is already just liberal democracy, but taking a violent, trajectory for the point of controlled opposition. But then the same thing can obviously be said about the reformist, less violent, more offering and payoff tendency that exists within, bourgeois socialism, which is controlled opposition, where they decide instead of the more violent tactic, they go for offering socialist frameworks, but under capitalism. And like I said, both work to defend capitalism. So I think that point was pretty clear. I think that video is probably could be edited down to be very short. It's going to be under an hour. I mean, without question. And this is a quick video. I'm gonna try to get it up in time. I might be up a little bit later today. It might take a little bit longer to process because I've been getting videos pretty consistently out at noon on Sunday, but this one might come out a little bit later. But obviously, whenever it comes out, it comes out, and that's it. That's it for this one.